The silver chains burned through Kieran's wrists as he watched the castle slave creep toward him in the darkness, her green eyes wide with terror and something else, recognition that made his dead heart stutter. For 10 years, he'd hung in these cursed depths, tortured by memories of the woman he'd failed to save. But this girl, this trembling, beautiful girl who dared to offer him water, she had Isadora's exact face. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracked from a decade of screaming. "What's your name?" "Seraphina," she breathed, and when their eyes met, the world exploded into silver fire. Above them, Master Aldric's footsteps echoed down the stone stairs, and Kieran realized with devastating clarity that fate had just delivered his reincarnated mate directly into the hands of the monster who'd killed her before. Chapter 1: The Blood-Stained Chains. Seraphina's bare feet slipped on the cold stone as she descended into the castle's forgotten depths. The iron key trembled in her grip, stolen from Master Aldric's chambers while he slept off another night of wine and cruelty. 20 years of servitude had taught her to move like smoke through these halls, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the very air seemed to whisper warnings as she approached the door that had been sealed for a decade. The rusty hinges screamed as she pushed it open, and the smell hit her first, metallic, ancient, like copper pennies left in rain. Then she saw him. Chained to the wall in silver that burned angry welts into his pale skin, a man hung suspended in the darkness. His black hair fell like a curtain across his face, but she could see the slow rise and fall of his chest. Alive, barely. His clothes had long since rotted away, leaving only tattered remnants that spoke of nobility from another age. The chains weren't just restraints, they were torture devices, designed to keep something powerful contained. As Seraphina stepped closer, her lantern casting dancing shadows on the walls, she noticed something that made her blood freeze. The floor beneath him was stained dark with years of blood, yet somehow, impossibly, his wounds had healed over and over again. "Please," came a voice so soft she almost missed it. His head lifted slowly, revealing a face that belonged in paintings, sharp cheekbones, full lips cracked from thirst, and eyes that glowed like molten silver in the lantern light. Those eyes held centuries of pain, but also something else. Hope. When their gazes met, Seraphina felt the world shift beneath her feet. This wasn't human. Whatever hung before her in those cursed chains was something far more dangerous, far more beautiful than anything she'd ever encountered. "Water," he whispered, and the single word carried such longing that tears sprang to her eyes. Without thinking, Seraphina lifted the water skin from her belt and stepped forward. Logic screamed at her to run. Master Aldric had forbidden anyone from entering this chamber for good reason. But as she looked into those silver eyes, she saw her own reflection. Two prisoners in the same castle, separated only by the nature of their chains. Her physical bondage could end with death or escape, but whatever held him here transcended the mortal world. She pressed the water skin to his lips, watching as he drank greedily, silver eyes never leaving her face. When he finished, something passed between them, a connection that made her soul sing and her survival instinct scream. "Who are you?" she breathed, already knowing the answer would change everything. He smiled then, and she glimpsed fangs white as starlight. "My name is Kieran Nightshade," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "And you, little castle slave, have just awakened something that your master spent 10 years trying to kill." Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, and somewhere in the castle above, a door slammed. Master Aldric was stirring. Seraphina's heart pounded as she realized the magnitude of what she'd done. She'd given water to a vampire who'd been chained for a decade, and now his silver eyes were growing brighter with each passing second. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in the Philippines, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. The memory of silver eyes haunted Seraphina through 3 sleepless days, but she had to survive the present before she could risk returning to the depths. Master Aldric's castle perched on a cliff overlooking the stormy North Sea, its black stones slick with perpetual mist. She'd been brought here as a child of 7, sold by parents who couldn't afford another mouth to feed. 20 years had passed since then, and every sunrise brought the same routine: scrub floors, tend fires, dodge Aldric's drunken rages, and pray for invisibility. The other servants whispered that she was cursed with beauty that brought only trouble, her auburn hair and green eyes marking her as different in a place where difference meant danger. But Aldric's attention had grown darker lately, his pale eyes following her movements with a hunger that made her skin crawl. At 27, Seraphina was past the age when most women found husbands, but servitude had preserved a youth that now felt like a curse. Just yesterday, he'd cornered her in the wine cellar, his wine-sour breath hot against her ear as he promised she'd soon be more than just a servant. The threat hung between them like a blade, and she knew her time was running out. Freedom felt as distant as the stars she glimpsed through her tiny window each night, but something had changed since she'd found the vampire. Hope, dangerous and addictive, had taken root in her chest. The silver-haired woman who ruled the kitchen, Moira, had been at the castle longer than anyone. She remembered when the sealed chamber had been built, when Master Aldric returned from a mysterious journey with chains that hummed with dark magic. Some doors are meant to stay locked, child, Moira warned as they kneaded bread in the pre-dawn darkness. That chamber holds something that nearly killed your master once. He's kept it contained for 10 years, feeding it just enough blood to keep it alive but too weak to escape. The old woman's hands shook as she spoke, flour dusting her weathered fingers. Promise me you'll stay away from the depths. But Seraphina couldn't promise that, not when Kieran's face haunted her dreams and his voice echoed in her mind. She'd seen the way the silver chains burned his skin, had watched tears of blood slip down his cheeks as he drank the water she'd given him. No creature, no matter how dangerous, deserved such torment. That night, she crept through the castle's twisting corridors once more, this time carrying stolen bread and a larger water skin. The guards were drunk as usual, Master Aldric lost in his wine-induced stupor. The key felt warm in her palm, as if it recognized her touch now, welcoming her return to the forbidden chamber. When she pushed open the heavy door, Kieran was waiting. His silver eyes tracked her movement as she approached, and she could swear he looked stronger than before. "You came back," he said, wonder coloring his voice. "I thought perhaps I'd dreamed you." Seraphina knelt beside him, offering water first, then small pieces of bread that he accepted gratefully. As she watched him eat, she realized that even chained and starving, he moved with an otherworldly grace that spoke of power barely contained. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why does he keep you here?" Kieran's eyes darkened, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "Because 10 years ago, I made the mistake of loving someone he considered his property." Chapter 2, The Vampire's Tale. Kieran's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he began his story, and Seraphina found herself leaning closer despite every instinct warning her to maintain distance. The lantern light flickered between them, casting dancing shadows on the damp stone walls that seemed to pulse with each word he spoke. "Her name was Isadora," he began, silver eyes growing distant with memory, as if he were seeing through time itself to moments that had shaped centuries of torment. "She was Aldric's ward, brought to the castle as a child much like you were. But Isadora had a gift that made her invaluable to a man like him. She could see the future in dreams, glimpses of what was to come that Aldric planned to use to expand his wealth and influence across the known world." His chains clinked softly as he shifted, the blessed silver burning fresh welts into his wrists with each movement, but he seemed oblivious to the pain as memories consumed him. Seraphina watched his face transform as he spoke of Isadora, seeing love and loss warring in his expression with an intensity that made her chest tight with sympathy. "I was hunting in the forests near the castle when I caught her scent on the wind," he continued, his voice taking on a reverent quality that spoke of something sacred being shared. "Vampires know their mates instantly. It's like recognizing a missing piece of your soul, like finding a melody you've been humming your entire existence without knowing the words. The moment her scent reached me, everything else in the world became secondary. The pain in his voice was so raw that Seraphina felt tears sting her eyes, though she couldn't understand why his story affected her so deeply. She'd never heard love described with such devastating certainty, never imagined that souls could call to each other across impossible distances with such primal recognition. As he spoke, she found her hand unconsciously moving to her left wrist, fingers tracing over the crescent-shaped birthmark that had been there since birth, a mark her mother had always told her was a sign of blessing from the moon goddess. The gesture felt automatic, instinctive, as if her body remembered something her mind had forgotten. I courted her carefully, Kieran continued, unaware of Seraphina's unconscious movement. I appeared as a traveling nobleman seeking shelter from storms, playing the part of someone harmless enough to be welcomed but interesting enough to capture attention. For 3 months, I visited under various pretenses: a merchant with exotic goods, a scholar researching local history, a diplomat carrying messages between distant courts. Each visit, I fell deeper under her spell, and she began to dream of futures that had nothing to do with Aldric's ambitions. His expression softened with remembered tenderness. She told me once that her dreams had changed, that instead of seeing Aldric's empire expanding, she saw gardens in moonlight and a love that would transcend death itself. Kieran's laugh held no humor, only bitter regret that seemed to echo off the chamber walls like a curse. But Aldric discovered our connection when Isadora could no longer hide the joy in her eyes. She'd always been a serious child, focused entirely on her visions and their meanings, but love had awakened something bright and defiant in her spirit. He realized that her prophetic dreams had shifted from serving his ambitions to revealing paths of freedom, and he knew that meant she'd found someone who mattered more to her than duty or fear. The vampire's voice grew darker, and Seraphina could see the moment when hope had transformed into nightmare in his memories. As Kieran spoke, something strange began happening to Seraphina. Images flickered at the edges of her consciousness, brief, dreamlike flashes that felt more real than memory should. She saw herself running through moonlit corridors, her heart pounding with excitement and terror in equal measure. She felt phantom sensations of silk against her skin, the weight of elaborate jewelry, the taste of wine sweetened with honey. But beneath these surface impressions lay something deeper, more disturbing, the memory of silver eyes looking at her with infinite tenderness, of pale hands gentle against her skin, of a voice whispering promises of forever in the darkness. The night we planned to leave, Kieran continued, his voice growing hollow as if speaking the words physically pained him, Aldric was waiting. He'd learned what I was through methods I still don't fully understand, dark priests and ancient texts, rituals that could reveal the true nature of supernatural beings. He'd prepared weapons blessed by those same priests and chains forged with silver from a cursed mine that had been used to bind demons centuries before. The vampire's hands clenched into fists despite his restraints, supernatural strength making the blessed metal groan in protest. But the worst part wasn't the trap itself, it was the choice he gave me. Seraphina watched as Kieran's composure finally cracked, revealing the raw agony that 10 years of imprisonment had failed to dull. He said I could leave freely, walk away, and never return, if I abandoned Isadora to her fate. He would use her visions to build his empire, eventually drain her gift until it killed her, but he would let me go unharmed. Silver eyes met hers with devastating honesty. For one terrible moment, I considered it. Self-preservation is strong in vampires, and I could have had centuries more of existence if I'd simply walked away. But when I looked at her face, saw the fear she was trying to hide behind brave defiance, I knew that living without her would be a death worse than any Aldric could devise. The images in Seraphina's mind were growing stronger now, no longer brief flashes but sustained visions that overlapped with the present moment. She could see herself, but not herself, someone who looked exactly like her but dressed in the fine clothes of nobility, standing in this very chamber when it had been different, cleaner, lit by torches instead of her simple lantern. The other Seraphina was younger, perhaps 19, with the same auburn hair and green eyes but carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had never known true hardship. And beside her stood Kieran, not chained and broken but magnificent in his power, reaching for her with hands that promised protection and love eternal. He forced me to watch as he killed her, Kieran said, and the words hit Seraphina like physical blows. Made sure I understood that my immortality would be spent in endless torment, remembering the woman I'd failed to save. But it wasn't a quick death. Aldric wanted me to suffer as much as possible, so he made it slow, deliberate, ensuring that every moment of her pain was burned into my memory forever. His voice broke completely then, and Seraphina realized she was witnessing the moment when love had transformed into something darker, more desperate. She looked at me as she died, silver tears on her cheeks, and whispered that she would find a way back to me. I thought it was delirium, the desperate hope of someone facing the void, but now Kieran's silver eyes fixed on Seraphina's left wrist, where her fingers still traced the crescent birthmark with unconscious familiarity. His expression shifted from confusion to wonder to something approaching awe as recognition dawned. "Show me your wrist," he said, his voice barely audible. "Please, Seraphina, I need to see." She extended her arm without thinking, rolling back the coarse fabric of her sleeve to reveal the mark she'd carried since birth. It was small, no larger than a silver coin, but perfectly formed, a crescent moon with 7 tiny stars arranged around its curve like a crown. "Impossible," Kieran breathed, but his eyes blazed with hope that was almost painful to witness. Isadora had the exact same mark, in the exact same place. She said it was a family birthmark, passed down through generations of women with prophetic gifts. "But you're not related to her, you're Thornfield," she was. He stopped, understanding flooding his features as pieces of an impossible puzzle fell into place. Unless souls can be reborn into different bloodlines. The moment he spoke those words, Seraphina's world exploded into memory and sensation. She was no longer sitting in a dungeon chamber, she was dying in Kieran's arms 27 years ago, feeling her life ebb away while silver chains burned his skin as he held her. She remembered the taste of his blood on her lips, sweet and metallic and tinged with the desperation of someone trying to save what couldn't be saved. She remembered the way his voice broke as he begged her to stay, promised he would find a way to free them both if she could just hold on a little longer. But most clearly, she remembered her final words, not the desperate hope Kieran had described, but a spell. A working of power she'd never attempted before, fueled by love and desperation and the absolute certainty that death would not separate them. She'd poured her soul into magic older than vampire and human alike, weaving her essence into the very fabric of fate with the prayer that somehow, someway, she would find her way back to him. The last thing she'd seen before darkness claimed her was the silver fire of her power flowing into the ley lines beneath the castle, seeking a bloodline strong enough to carry her essence forward through time. "I remember," Seraphina whispered, and her voice carried harmonics that hadn't been there moments before, the echo of another soul awakening within her own. "I remember dying in your arms, remember the way you held me even though the chains were burning through your skin. I remember telling you I would find a way back, but I never told you how." Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't entirely her own, they belonged to Isadora, to the love that had been interrupted but never destroyed. "I wove my soul into a reincarnation spell, guided it to the Thornfield bloodline because their magic was strong enough to hide me until it was safe to remember." Kieran's expression cycled through disbelief, hope, and dawning joy so intense it was almost frightening. 27 years, he said, understanding flooding his voice. "You were born exactly 27 years ago, weren't you? The same day Isadora died." When Seraphina nodded, he laughed, a sound of pure relief and wonder that seemed to chase shadows from the chamber's corners. "Your mother Eleanor must have known. She would have felt the magic when your soul chose her bloodline, would have understood what you were. That's why she hid you so carefully, why she erased every trace of your heritage. She was protecting not just a Thornfield heir, but the reincarnated soul of a vampire's mate." The implications hit Seraphina like a physical blow. Her entire life, her mother's paranoia and secrecy, the way Eleanor had died protecting secrets she'd never fully explained, all of it made sense now. "She never told me," Seraphina said, her voice mixing her own confusion with Isadora's recovered memories. She said the birthmark was a blessing, but she never said from whom. She taught me to hide my power, to never let anyone see what I could do, but she never explained why. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks as she realized the magnitude of her mother's sacrifice. She raised another woman's soul as her own daughter, loved me knowing I would eventually remember a love that had nothing to do with her. For 10 years, he's kept me here, Kieran continued, his voice taking on new layers of meaning as he looked at her with recognition blazing in his silver eyes. 10 years of silver burning my skin, of just enough blood to keep me alive but too weak to break free. He visits sometimes, to gloat about the empire he's built using artifacts he stole from my family's ancient vaults. His expression shifted, hope and love warring with protective fury. But he doesn't know what he's had under his roof all this time. He's been enslaving my mate for 20 years, the one soul in all the world that could give me strength enough to break any chain. Something shifted in his expression then, a flicker of power that made him look far more dangerous than his chains should have allowed. But you're different from who you were before, aren't you? I can sense it, there's something in your blood that calls to more than just my vampire nature. Something that feels like pack magic, like territorial power that shouldn't exist in a reincarnated soul. His eyes studied her face with new intensity, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. The Thornfield bloodline didn't just hide you, it enhanced you. You're both Isadora and something entirely new, carrying powers that no single being should possess. Seraphina felt the truth of his words resonating in her bones. She was both souls now, Isadora's memories and love existing alongside Seraphina's own experiences and the pack magic that flowed through Thornfield veins. The combination was intoxicating and terrifying, like standing at the edge of an abyss that promised either transcendence or destruction. "What does that make me?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would change everything between them. "Am I still the woman you loved, or someone else entirely?" "You're both," Kieran said without hesitation, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had loved across lifetimes. "You're Isadora's soul with new experiences, new power, new strength forged through hardship she never had to endure. You're the woman I lost and the woman I was meant to find." His chains clinked as he leaned forward as far as his restraints would allow, silver eyes blazing with renewed purpose. "Which means you have the power to break these chains, to free us both from Aldric's prison. The magic that bound your soul to a new bloodline, that same power could dissolve blessed silver if you remembered how to use it." Before Seraphina could respond to his revelation, before she could even begin to process what it meant to be both herself and someone else entirely, footsteps echoed from the corridor above. Heavy boots, moving with purpose toward the depths of the castle, accompanied by the metallic clink of armor and weapons. Master Aldric was coming, and he wasn't alone. The sound of multiple sets of feet suggested he'd brought guards, more than usual, as if some instinct had warned him that tonight was different from the countless nights that had come before. "Hide," Kieran hissed, his eyes flashing with protective fury that transcended his physical restraints. "Behind the old torture rack, now." But his voice carried new urgency, as if he understood that discovery now would mean more than just punishment for a disobedient slave. If Aldric realized who Seraphina truly was, if he understood that the reincarnated soul of his greatest victory was within his reach, the consequences would be beyond imagination. Seraphina scrambled into the shadows just as the chamber door burst open, her heart pounding with terror that belonged to both her current self and the memories of a woman who had died in this very room. Master Aldric entered flanked by 2 armed guards, but something was different about his demeanor tonight. His pale eyes held a sharpness that spoke of suspicion confirmed rather than routine inspection, and the way he moved suggested he was hunting rather than simply gloating. "Still alive, I see," he sneered, but his voice carried undertones that made Kieran tense against his chains. "Good. I have a proposition for you, creature, one that might finally give meaning to these wasted years." He gestured for his guards to position themselves strategically around the chamber, their silver-tipped spears gleaming in the lantern light. "There's a werewolf pack moving through my territory, and I need someone with your particular skills to deal with them." From her hiding place, Seraphina watched the scene unfold with two sets of memories, her own terror at discovery, and Isadora's knowledge of exactly how dangerous Aldric could be when he suspected he was losing control. The birthmark on her wrist burned with phantom heat, as if responding to the proximity of the man who had killed her once before, and she realized with crystal clarity that her awakening memories had changed everything. She was no longer just a castle slave who had stumbled upon a chained vampire, she was a reincarnated soul whose very existence threatened the foundation of Aldric's power, and whose love might finally be strong enough to break chains that had held for 10 years. Master Aldric circled Kieran like a predator savoring wounded prey, his pale eyes glittering with malicious intent. "The Shadow Moon Pack has been hunting something that belongs to me," he said, gesturing for his guards to step closer with their silver-tipped spears. "They've tracked it to my lands, and their alpha has demanded a meeting. How delightfully convenient that I have a vampire who once commanded their respect." From her hiding place behind the rusted torture rack, Seraphina watched Kieran's expression harden into stone. The vampire's silver eyes never left Aldric's face, but she could see the way his muscles tensed against his chains, supernatural strength barely contained by blessed silver. "I will never serve you willingly," Kieran said, his voice carrying the authority of centuries. "And the wolves will smell your corruption the moment they cross your threshold." Aldric's laugh echoed off the chamber walls like breaking glass. "Who said anything about willing? You'll do exactly as I command, or I'll find new ways to make these past 10 years seem like paradise." He nodded to one of the guards, who produced a vial of dark liquid that seemed to absorb the lantern light. "This little concoction will ensure your cooperation. A mixture of werewolf blood and blessed mercury. It won't kill you, but it will make you wish it could." The guard approached with the vial, and Seraphina watched in horror as Kieran's eyes flashed with desperate fury. She could see the precise moment when the vampire made his choice, not to submit, but to protect her even at the cost of greater torment. "Wait," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow commanded more attention than a shout. "The pack you mention, is their alpha named Fenris Blackthorn?" Aldric paused, clearly surprised by the question. "You know him?" Something dangerous flickered in Kieran's expression, a hint of the power that had once made him feared across the supernatural world. "We have history." Before Aldric could respond, a howl split the night air, long, haunting, and filled with primal authority. It was answered by another, then another, until the very stones of the castle seemed to vibrate with lupin song. The werewolves had arrived. Aldric's face went pale as he realized his timeline had just accelerated beyond his control. "They're early," he snarled, gesturing frantically to his guards. "Get him ready, now." But as the guard moved forward with the vial, Kieran's chains suddenly went slack. The blessed silver that had held him for 10 years began to smoke and crack, as if his renewed hope had somehow weakened their power. "Impossible," Aldric breathed, stumbling backward as Kieran slowly, impossibly, began to stand. The vampire's silver eyes blazed like stars as he looked directly at Seraphina's hiding place, and she understood with crystal clarity that her presence had somehow changed the fundamental magic binding him. "You made one critical error, Aldric," Kieran said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You assumed that love was my weakness." The chamber door exploded inward as something massive and furred landed in the entrance, golden eyes blazing with protective fury. The Alpha had found them, and everything Seraphina thought she knew about the world was about to shatter like glass. The creature filling the doorway stood nearly 7 feet tall, caught between human and wolf form in a display of barely controlled transformation. His massive frame was covered in midnight black fur that seemed to absorb the lantern light, and his golden eyes burned with an intelligence that was unmistakably ancient. When he spoke, his voice carried the rumble of distant thunder and the authority of someone who had never been denied. "Release the vampire, Aldric. This ends now." Master Aldric stumbled backward, his face draining of color as he realized his guard's silver spears were useless against an alpha werewolf in full protective fury. The creature's gaze swept the chamber, taking in Kieran's broken chains and Seraphina's hidden form in a single, devastating assessment. Fenris, Kieran said, and Seraphina heard genuine warmth in the vampire's voice for the first time since she'd found him. Still making dramatic entrances, I see. The massive werewolf's lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing fangs that could tear through steel. Still getting yourself chained up by petty human tyrants, I see. Despite the banter, tension crackled between them, not hostile, but the complex wariness of two apex predators who respected each other's power. Seraphina realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, a vampire and werewolf who shared some kind of bond that transcended their species' ancient enmity. Aldric recovered his composure with visible effort, his hand moving to the blessed dagger at his belt. You have no authority here, beast. This is human territory, and I am its master. Fenris's golden eyes fixed on him with the focused intensity of a predator selecting prey. You're mistaken about several things, human. First, you stopped being master of anything the moment you took something that belongs to my pack. The Alpha's gaze shifted meaningfully to Seraphina's hiding place, and she felt her heart stop. Somehow, impossibly, he knew exactly where she was. Second, this hasn't been purely human territory for quite some time. What are you talking about? Aldric demanded, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. Fenris stepped fully into the chamber, and Seraphina could see other shapes moving in the corridor behind him, the rest of his pack, waiting for their alpha signal. The woman hiding behind that torture rack carries bloodlines that make her far more valuable than you could possibly understand, Fenris said, his golden eyes never leaving Aldric's face. She's the last of the Thornfield line, descended from the original pack witches who bound supernatural territories to their bloodlines. You've been enslaving someone whose very existence gives her claim to these lands. The revelation hit Seraphina like a physical blow. She wasn't just a castle slave. She was the rightful heir to supernatural territories that predated human settlements by centuries. As if responding to this knowledge, power stirred in her chest, unfamiliar but undeniably hers. The silver chains that had held Kieran clattered to the floor, completely dissolved by magic she didn't understand. Both vampire and werewolf turned to look at her as she stepped out of the shadows, and in their eyes she saw not just recognition, but reverence. Whatever she was, whatever power flowed through her bloodline, it was enough to break a decade of vampire imprisonment and command the respect of an alpha werewolf. Chapter 3, Blood and Magic. Power hummed through Seraphina's veins like liquid lightning as she stepped into the chamber's center, and she watched three of the supernatural world's most dangerous beings regard her with expressions ranging from awe to hunger. The very air around her crackled with energy that made the ancient stones sing in harmonics that hadn't been heard for generations, while silver light danced between her fingers like living flame. Kieran, now free of his silver chains that lay dissolved into metallic dust on the chamber floor, moved with fluid grace to place himself protectively between her and Aldric, his vampire senses overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of power radiating from the woman he'd loved across lifetimes. Fenris's massive frame blocked the doorway with casual authority, his golden eyes reflecting the supernatural light that poured from Seraphina's awakening magic. But it was Master Aldric's expression that chilled her most, not just naked greed mixed with dawning understanding, but something deeper, more personal that made her soul recoil in instinctive revulsion. His pale eyes weren't just calculating new possibilities as he realized what he'd kept as a slave for 20 years, they held recognition, familiarity, and a satisfaction that spoke of plans decades in the making finally bearing fruit. Thornfield, he breathed, but the way he said her family name carried intimacy that made Seraphina's skin crawl. The lost bloodline that every supernatural faction has been searching for. His voice dropped to a whisper that the words hit the chamber like a physical blow, and Seraphina felt the world tilt beneath her feet as their impossible meaning sank in. Around her, silver light flickered and pulsed as her power responded to emotional turmoil, while Kieran's protective growl rumbled through the air like distant thunder. "What did you say?" she whispered, though part of her already knew the answer would shatter everything she believed about her origin and purpose. Aldric's smile revealed teeth that seemed sharper than they should be, more predatory than human features could accommodate, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of secrets kept for nearly 3 decades. Lost no more, Fenris said, his voice carrying pack authority that made even Kieran defer slightly, but there was confusion in his golden eyes as he processed Aldric's claim. Seraphina Thornfield, daughter of the last pack witch, inheritor of territorial magic that predates human memory. As he spoke her true name, power surged through her body with painful intensity, but now she could feel something else threaded through the familiar pack magic, something darker, more corrosive, that tasted of sulfur and bitter herbs. Memories that weren't quite memories flickered at the edges of her consciousness, stone circles under starlight, ancient pacts sealed in blood, her mother's face twisted with desperation and something that might have been shame as she erased all traces of their lineage. My mother, Seraphina whispered, understanding flooding through her like cold water, but the understanding was tainted now with horror as pieces of a devastating puzzle began falling into place. She hid what I was to protect me. But even as she spoke the words, new questions arose, questions about why Eleanor Thornfield had lived in such isolation, why she'd seemed perpetually afraid, why she'd sometimes looked at her daughter with expressions that mixed love with something approaching grief. The silver light around Seraphina pulsed more violently as her emotional state destabilized, and she could feel power building to levels that threatened to tear the very fabric of reality. Aldric stepped forward despite Kieran's warning growl, his pale eyes fixed on Seraphina's face with the intensity of someone studying a masterwork they'd spent years creating. "Oh, Eleanor hid far more than just your heritage, my dear daughter," he said, and the endearment dripped with poison that made Seraphina's stomach turn. "She hid the circumstances of your conception, the true nature of your power, and most importantly, she hid the fact that you were never meant to be just another Thornfield witch." His smile widened as he watched horror dawn in her green eyes. "You were meant to be the bridge between light and shadow, the weapon that could command both supernatural factions and corrupt them from within." Kieran moved closer, his silver eyes bright with protective fury as he sensed her distress, but also with growing understanding as pieces of supernatural lore clicked into place. "Eleanor Thornfield was the most powerful pack witch in 3 centuries, he said gently, though his voice carried new undertones of dread. When the supernatural world erupted into war, she went into hiding rather than let the factions use her daughter as a weapon." His pale hand lifted as if to comfort her, then stopped as he realized the implications of Aldric's revelation. But if what he's claiming is true, then she wasn't just hiding from factions, she was hiding from him. The chamber seemed to hold its breath as Aldric began to speak, his voice taking on the cadence of someone recounting a treasured memory. 27 years ago, I was a different man than the one you know, younger, more ambitious, but lacking the power necessary to achieve my goals. I'd heard whispers of the Thornfield line, legends of witches whose bloodline magic could reshape territories and bend supernatural law to their will. His pale eyes grew distant with memory, but the predatory satisfaction never left his expression. Eleanor was living alone in the ancient woods, maintaining the old wards and tending sacred groves that had been in her family's care for generations. Beautiful, powerful, and tragically naive about the depths of human ambition. Seraphina felt bile rise in her throat as understanding crashed over her like a poisonous wave. "You didn't just encounter her by chance," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying harmonics that made the chamber walls tremble. "You hunted her." The silver light around her began to take on darker hues, deep purples and midnight blues that spoke of magic corrupted by rage and revelation. Behind her, she could feel Kieran's presence like a steadying anchor, while Fenris's massive form shifted with barely contained violence as the alpha werewolf processed the full implications of what was being revealed. "I courted her carefully," Aldric continued, his voice holding no shame, only the satisfaction of someone recounting a successful conquest. "For months, I played the part of a scholar researching ancient bloodlines, a romantic figure drawn to her beauty and wisdom. She was lonely, had been alone in those woods for years protecting secrets her family had died to preserve, and she was so grateful for companionship that she never suspected my true purpose." His laugh was like breaking glass, sharp and cutting in the supernatural charged air. "By the time she realized what I truly was, what I wanted from her, it was far too late to resist. The power building around Seraphina reached critical levels as rage unlike anything she'd ever experienced flooded through her veins. This wasn't just the anger of learning about her mother's assault. This was primal fury that tasted of both pack magic and something far darker, something that whispered of destruction and vengeance without limit. "You raped her," she said, and each word carried enough force to crack the ancient stones beneath their feet. "You stole her magic and left her pregnant with your abomination." Silver light exploded outward from her position, but threaded through it now were tendrils of shadow that seemed to absorb rather than illuminate, creating a light show that was both beautiful and terrifying. "Abomination?" Aldric's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "My dear daughter, you wound me. You're not an abomination, you're perfection. A hybrid of the most powerful pack magic in existence and the dark sorcery that flows through my own bloodline." He gestured grandly at the magical display surrounding her. "Look at yourself. You dissolved vampire chains that were blessed by holy priests and forged in cursed silver. You're awakening without proper rituals or guidance, commanding power that should require decades of training. You're everything I dreamed you could become." Kieran stepped protectively closer, his vampire senses reading the dangerous levels of magic building in the chamber. "She's not your weapon," he said, his voice carrying centuries of authority and the absolute certainty of someone prepared to die for his convictions. "Whatever you did to Eleanor, whatever dark purpose you had in mind, Seraphina chooses her own path." But even as he spoke, Seraphina could see concern in his silver eyes as he watched the way shadow and light warred around her form. The power she was displaying went beyond anything a pure Thornfield bloodline should possess, and the dark threads woven through her magic spoke of corruption that ran soul deep. "My mother never told me," Seraphina said, her voice mixing her own confusion with Isadora's recovered memories and something else, something that carried the weight of inherited trauma passed down through bloodlines. "She raised me knowing what you were, knowing what you'd done to her, and she never said a word." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but they weren't entirely her own anymore. They belonged to Eleanor Thornfield, to the woman who had sacrificed everything to protect a daughter born from violence, who had loved unconditionally despite the circumstances of conception. Fenris, who had remained silent through most of the revelation, finally spoke, his voice carrying the measured authority of an alpha who had seen too much darkness in his long life. "This explains the unusual readings we've been getting from the territorial magic," he said, his golden eyes fixed on the interplay of light and shadow surrounding Seraphina. "Pure Thornfield power would resonate with pack frequencies, but there's something else here, something that feels like necromancy and blood magic combined." His massive head turned to regard Aldric with predatory focus. "What exactly did you do to claim her mother's power?" Aldric's satisfaction grew even more pronounced as he realized his audience was beginning to understand the full scope of his achievement. "I didn't just take Eleanor's body," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the chamber. "I bound her magic to mine through a ritual older than recorded history, one that required months of preparation and precise timing. When I finally claimed her, it wasn't just rape, it was magical fusion that created something entirely new." He gestured towards Seraphina with obvious pride. "Our daughter carries both bloodlines perfectly integrated, making her exponentially more powerful than any pure blood which could ever be." The revelation sent fresh waves of power surging through the chamber as Seraphina's emotional state reached breaking point. She could feel the truth of his words resonating in her bones, the dark magic that had always felt foreign in her veins, the way her power sometimes whispered suggestions that terrified her, the ease with which she could command forces that should have been beyond her reach. "That's why the chains dissolved," she said, understanding flooding through her voice. "It wasn't just pack magic breaking vampire restraints, it was dark sorcery corroding blessed silver from within." "Precisely." Aldric clapped his hands together with genuine delight, as if she were a prized student finally grasping a difficult lesson. "You see now why I kept you close all these years, why I couldn't simply sell you or dispose of you as I did with other inconvenient slaves. You were my greatest creation, my most important investment, and I needed to ensure you survived to reach full maturity." His pale eyes glittered with possessive hunger. "Every day of your enslavement was preparing you for this moment, building the resentment and rage necessary to fuel the darker aspects of your power." But Aldric wasn't finished with his calculations, and his next words proved that 20 years of planning had led to this exact moment. "If she's truly my daughter, then she belongs to whoever can properly bind her power," he snarled, but now his voice carried paternal authority rather than simple greed. 20 years of investment won't be lost to wolves and leeches, not when I can finally claim what is rightfully mine." He pulled the blessed dagger from his belt, but Seraphina could see now that it wasn't just a weapon, it was a ritual blade, covered in symbols that spoke of binding magic and blood oaths that could enslave even the most powerful supernatural beings. He lunged forward with desperate speed, the blessed dagger aimed not to kill but to cut, to draw the blood necessary for a binding ritual that would make her his weapon in truth. But the blade never reached its target as Seraphina's power erupted instinctively, sending him flying backward into the stone wall with enough force to crack the ancient stones and leave spider web fractures spreading outward like a broken mirror. Silver light poured from her fingertips, but now it was shot through with veins of pure darkness that seemed to absorb rather than illuminate, creating shadows that moved independently of any light source. The magical explosion illuminated symbols carved into the chamber walls that had been hidden for decades, wards and bindings that marked this place as supernaturally significant, but also something else. Protective circles that spoke of desperate magic, the kind of workings that mothers performed when they had nothing left to lose except their children's future. "She was here," Seraphina breathed as understanding dawned. "My mother performed the binding ritual here, in this very chamber. She used this place to hide my true nature, to suppress the dark magic until I was strong enough to choose which path to follow." "Impossible," Fenris breathed, but his golden eyes blazed with something that looked like hope mixed with terror as he recognized the implications. "She's awakening on her own, without a proper binding ritual, but she's also breaking through suppression magic that should have been permanent." Around them, the castle itself seemed to respond to Seraphina's emerging power, stones humming with energy that had been dormant for generations. But now that energy carried dual frequencies, the bright, clear notes of pack magic harmonizing with deeper, more ominous tones that spoke of power that came with a price. Kieran stepped closer, his vampire senses reading the magical currents in the air with growing concern and wonder. "She's not just awakening," he said, his voice colored with awe and fear in equal measure. "She's reclaiming everything, both the light and the shadow, the heritage and the corruption. This entire territory is remembering its true ownership, but it's also being claimed by something that was never meant to exist." Outside, howls erupted from every direction as the pack felt their new mistress's power surge through the ancient ley lines, but those howls carried notes of uncertainty as Lupin's senses detected the dark threads woven through otherwise familiar magic. From his position against the cracked wall, Aldric began to laugh, a sound that held no humor but infinite satisfaction as he watched his daughter struggle with the full implications of her dual heritage. "Do you understand now?" he asked, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth but his voice strong with triumph. "Every choice you make from this moment forward will be influenced by the darkness I wove into your very essence. You can try to follow the path of light, attempt to be the noble pack which your mother wanted you to become, but the shadow will always whisper alternative solutions." His pale eyes fixed on hers with predatory intensity. "And eventually, inevitably, you'll listen." Seraphina realized with crystal clarity that everything, her enslavement, Kieran's imprisonment, even Fenris's arrival, had been leading to this moment of terrible awakening. She stood at the crossroads between light and shadow, pack magic and dark sorcery, the woman her mother had tried to raise and the weapon her father had designed her to become. The power flowing through her veins was intoxicating and terrifying, offering solutions to every problem but at costs that made her soul recoil. As she looked around the chamber at the three men whose fates had become intertwined with hers, she understood that her next choice would determine not just her own destiny, but the future of every supernatural being who called this territory home. Chapter 4: The Binding Choice. Power coursed through the castle's ancient stones as Seraphina's awakening sent shockwaves through every supernatural ward and binding that had been dormant for decades. Master Aldric struggled to his feet, blood streaming from his head where he'd struck the wall, but his pale eyes remained fixed on her with desperate hunger. "You can't control it," he snarled, raising his blessed dagger once more. "Raw power without training will consume you from within. I can teach you to harness what you are, for a price." But before he could advance, Kieran moved with vampire speed, his pale hand closing around Aldric's throat with crushing force. For the first time in 10 years, "The only price she'll pay is the one she chooses," Kieran said, his silver eyes blazing with protective fury. The vampire's strength, fully restored by Seraphina's power, made Aldric's struggles laughably weak. But Fenris stepped forward, his massive hand touching Kieran's shoulder in a gesture that somehow conveyed both warning and understanding. "This isn't our choice to make," the Alpha said, his golden eyes fixed on Seraphina's face. "She must decide her own binding, choose her own protection. The old ways demand it." Something passed between vampire and werewolf, a shared history that spoke of respect earned through battle and blood. Seraphina felt the weight of their attention like physical pressure, but beneath the terror and confusion, something else stirred. Freedom. For the first time in 20 years, she stood in a room where her choice mattered more than anyone else's will. "What does binding mean?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Fenris's expression gentled, though his form remained imposingly lupin. "In the supernatural world, power like yours requires protection and guidance. You can bind yourself to a pack, accepting their protection in exchange for your magical support. You can ally with a vampire coven, trading knowledge for safety. Or," he glanced meaningfully at Kieran, "you can forge an individual bond with someone strong enough to stand against entire factions." "And if I choose none of those?" Seraphina asked, though she already knew the answer from the way both supernatural beings tensed. "Then every faction in existence will hunt you until one succeeds in claiming your power by force," Kieran said bluntly. "Your mother hid you well, but awakened power can't be concealed. By dawn, every supernatural creature within 100 miles will know you exist." His silver eyes held hers with desperate intensity. "I won't lie to you, Seraphina. Binding yourself to me would make you a target for vampire politics and ancient enemies. But I would die before letting anyone harm you." Before she could respond, the chamber door exploded inward as Master Aldric's human guards burst through, armed with crossbows and silver bolts. "Kill the monsters," Aldric gasped from Kieran's grip. "Take the witch alive." But as the first crossbow bolt flew toward Fenris, Seraphina's power erupted in a protective shield that turned the silver projectile to dust. In that moment of pure instinct, she realized her choice had already been made. Not between vampire and werewolf, not between factions and freedom, but between the girl who had been enslaved and the woman who would never bow to anyone's will again. Power flowed through her like molten gold, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of her bloodline. "I bind myself to no one. But I choose my allies." Seraphina's declaration sent ripples of power through the supernatural realm that reached far beyond the castle walls, like a beacon announcing the return of magic that had been lost for generations. The very air around her shimmered with energy that made reality itself seem fluid, while silver light cascaded from her fingertips in patterns that spoke of authority beyond mortal comprehension. As the human guard's silver bolts turned to ash in the air around her, she felt the weight of every supernatural gaze turning in her direction, not just those present in the chamber, but creatures across vast distances who suddenly found their senses overwhelmed by the scent of power that shouldn't exist. The awakening of a hybrid Thornfield was like a trumpet blast announcing the beginning of a new age, and every faction that had spent decades searching for her bloodline now knew exactly where to find her. Fenris's pack howled in unison from the castle grounds, their voices carrying news of the awakening across the countryside in harmonics that traveled faster than any mortal messenger could run. But even as their lupin songs spread the word, Seraphina noticed something strange in the way Fenris himself stood, not with the protective stance she'd grown accustomed to, but with the rigid posture of someone fighting an internal battle. His golden eyes kept flicking between her face and the pack outside, as if calculating distances and timing with predatory precision. Meanwhile, Kieran's enhanced senses picked up movement in the forests that surrounded the castle, other vampires, drawn by the scent of ancient power finally unleashed, moving through the trees with the coordinated purpose of a hunting party. "They're coming," Kieran said, his silver eyes scanning the shadows beyond the chamber door with the focused intensity of someone who had survived countless supernatural conflicts. "Every faction that's been searching for the lost Thornfield bloodline." His voice carried undertones of concern that went beyond simple protective instincts. This was the worry of someone who understood exactly how valuable Seraphina had become to creatures who measured worth in terms of power that could be claimed or controlled. The vampire moved closer to her, positioning himself between her and the doorway with fluid grace that spoke of centuries of combat experience, but his attention kept drifting to Fenris with the wariness of someone who sensed hidden threats. Master Aldric, still trapped in Kieran's grip but no longer struggling against restraints that had become meaningless in the face of his daughter's awakening, began to laugh with manic desperation that echoed off the chamber walls like breaking glass. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth where he'd struck the stone wall, but his pale eyes blazed with satisfaction that transcended physical pain. "You think you've won something?" he asked, his voice carrying the vindictive pleasure of someone whose plans had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. "She's a beacon now, calling every monster in the realm to my doorstep. They'll tear this castle apart stone by stone to reach her, and when the dust settles, whoever survives will claim the greatest prize in supernatural history." His pale eyes fixed on Seraphina with hungry malice that made her skin crawl, but beneath the surface greed lay something deeper, paternal pride twisted into something monstrous by decades of careful planning. "How long do you think your vampire and his fleabag ally can hold off an entire supernatural army?" Aldric continued, his gaze shifting meaningfully to Fenris. "Especially when one of them might not be quite the ally you think he is." The words were spoken casually, almost as an afterthought, but Seraphina noticed the way Fenris's massive frame tensed at the implication, golden eyes flashing with something that might have been guilt or rage. Before anyone could respond to Aldric's cryptic warning, windows throughout the castle began to shatter in sequence as something massive struck the outer walls with deliberate force. The sound wasn't random destruction, it was controlled, purposeful, the methodical approach of someone who wanted to announce their arrival without actually damaging anything they might later want to claim. Not an attack, but a landing that spoke of arrogance so complete it required no stealth or subtlety. Dragon wings, dark as midnight and spanning nearly 50 feet, folded against the ancient stones as their rider dismounted with predatory grace that made even Kieran look clumsy by comparison. "Lysander Drakemore," Fenris growled, his lupin features twisting with what Seraphina had assumed was recognition and distaste, but now she wondered if there might be more complex emotions hidden beneath the alpha's response. "The Vampire Council's enforcer." His voice carried undertones that spoke of history between the two supernatural beings, not necessarily hostile, but complicated in ways that suggested previous encounters hadn't been entirely straightforward. Through the broken windows came the sound of more arrivals, feet that moved too lightly to be human, voices that carried the otherworldly harmonics of Fey speech, and the rhythmic chanting that announced the approach of witch covens who had sensed the awakening and traveled through the night to witness it firsthand. Seraphina's awakening had drawn every major supernatural faction within traveling distance, and they were converging on the castle like predators responding to the scent of blood on the wind. The night air filled with sounds that spoke of creatures older than human civilization, beings who had spent generations searching for the power she now carried in her veins. "We need to move," Kieran said, his protective instincts warring with the reality of their situation as he assessed the overwhelming odds they faced. Too many enemies, not enough exits. But even as he spoke, his silver eyes kept returning to Fenris with growing suspicion, as if some instinct was warning him that their situation might be even more complicated than it appeared. But Seraphina stepped forward, power swirling around her like visible heat that made the air itself shimmer with barely contained energy. The mixture of pack magic and dark sorcery that flowed through her veins responded to her emotional state, creating displays of light and shadow that spoke of capabilities beyond anything a pure bloodline which should possess. "No more running," she said, her voice carrying new authority that made both vampire and werewolf straighten in response, though she noticed Fenris's reaction seemed more like a predator acknowledging a worthy opponent than a guardian accepting orders from his charge. "I've spent 20 years as someone's property," she continued, silver light dancing around her fingers as memories of enslavement fueled the darker aspects of her hybrid power, "and I won't spend the next 20 as someone's prize." She turned to face the shattered windows, where dark shapes moved against the storm-lashed sky with the coordinated precision of beings who had planned this convergence for far longer than the few hours since her awakening. "If they want the last Thornfield, let them come and ask properly." Her magic reached out, touching the ancient wards carved into the castle's foundations, awakening protections that had slumbered since her mother's time but now responded to blood that carried both light and shadow. The very stones began to glow with silver light that spoke of unbreachable sanctuary, but the protective aura was shot through with veins of darkness that suggested the wards themselves had been corrupted by her hybrid nature. As the magical defenses activated, Seraphina felt a moment of triumph, until she noticed the way Fenris was studying the ward patterns with the focused intensity of someone looking for weaknesses rather than admiring their strength. Before she could question his behavior, the great hall's doors burst open to admit a figure that commanded attention through sheer presence alone. Outside, a voice rang across the castle grounds with the authority of centuries, Lysander Drakemore, speaking for the vampire council that had ruled the night for millennia. His words carried power that made the ancient stones tremble, each syllable weighted with the kind of supernatural authority that could compel obedience from lesser beings. "Seraphina Thornfield, by right of supernatural law, you are called to account for power that affects all our kinds. Submit to council judgment, or face the consequences of rebellion." The ultimatum hung in the air like a blade, promising consequences that would extend far beyond personal punishment to encompass everyone who had chosen to stand with her. But before either Kieran or Seraphina could respond to the challenge, Fenris threw back his massive head and howled, not the protective challenge she'd expected, but something far more complex. The sound carried harmonics that spoke of pack communication, codes and signals that only other werewolves would fully understand. To Seraphina's ears, it sounded like defiance, but she noticed the way some howls from outside answered with what sounded almost like confusion or disappointment. As if the pack had been expecting a different signal entirely. The moment of uncertainty was shattered by a sound that chilled everyone in the chamber, the wet, labored breathing of something dying. From the doorway crawled a figure that made even Fenris step back in what might have been shock or recognition. It was a werewolf, but barely recognizable as such, fur matted with blood, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, eyes glazed with the approach of death but still burning with desperate purpose. The creature's scent carried the unmistakable markers of Fenris's pack, but also something else that made Kieran's nostrils flare with sudden understanding. "Beta Marcus," Fenris said, and for the first time since Seraphina had met him, the Alpha's voice carried genuine emotion, not grief, as she might have expected, but something closer to panic. "You should be with the rest of the pack. Your injuries," but the dying werewolf cut him off with a gesture that sprayed blood across the ancient stones, his failing strength focused entirely on reaching Seraphina before his body finally gave out. "Had to warn her," Marcus gasped, each word a struggle that cost him precious energy he couldn't afford to spend. "The prophecy." Alpha lied, "We didn't come to protect." His breathing hitched, blood frothing at the corners of his mouth as internal injuries overwhelmed his supernatural healing abilities. "Came to kill her, prevent the ending, but the prophecy." He fixed his dying gaze on Seraphina's face with desperate intensity. "Says last Thornfield will either unite all factions, or destroy them all." The revelation hit the chamber like a physical blow, and Seraphina felt the world shift beneath her feet as the implications sank in. Everything she believed about Fenris's arrival, every protective gesture he'd made, every moment she'd trusted him to stand between her and danger, all of it had been a lie designed to position him for the perfect killing strike. "No," she breathed, power flickering around her as emotional turmoil destabilized her magical control. "You came here to murder me." Fenris's massive form seemed to shrink as the truth was finally spoken aloud, golden eyes that had seemed so protective now revealing the calculation that had always lurked beneath the surface. The Shadow Moon Pack has been hunting Thornfield descendants for 3 generations, he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of traditions older than living memory. Not out of hatred, but out of necessity. The prophecy is clear, the last of the bloodline will either bring supernatural peace or supernatural apocalypse. There is no middle ground, no safe option. And you decided I was too dangerous to live, Seraphina said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the chamber walls tremble with barely contained power. The betrayal cut deeper than physical wounds, striking at the very foundation of trust she'd begun to build in her new understanding of the supernatural world. You played protector so I would never see the knife coming. Silver light exploded around her, but now it was shot through with veins of pure Marcus, using the last of his strength, managed to speak once more before death claimed him. But something changed, he wheezed, his eyes fixed on Fenris with an expression that mixed accusation with something that might have been hope. Alpha hesitated when he saw her power, started to question whether destruction might be evolution instead of ending. The dying werewolf's gaze shifted back to Seraphina. He's been fighting the kill order for hours, torn between duty and possibility. The beta's words trailed off into silence as death finally claimed him, leaving the chamber filled with a tension so thick it seemed to have physical weight. Fenris stood frozen, his massive frame radiating the internal conflict Marcus had described, the war between a lifetime of conditioning and the growing understanding that everything his pack had believed might be catastrophically wrong. Around them, the sounds of supernatural factions gathering grew louder, but now those arrivals carried new menace as Seraphina realized she might be facing enemies on every side. Is it true? Kieran asked, his silver eyes blazing with protective fury as he positioned himself between Seraphina and the alpha werewolf who had just been revealed as her would-be assassin. Have you been planning to kill her this entire time? The vampire's voice carried centuries of authority and the promise of violence that would make their previous conflicts seem like gentle disagreements. His fangs extended fully as supernatural instincts responded to the threat against his mate. Fenris met Kieran's gaze without flinching, but there was something broken in his golden eyes, the look of someone whose fundamental beliefs had been shattered by evidence he could no longer ignore. The prophecy has guided pack law for over 200 years, he said slowly, each word carefully chosen. Every alpha learns the signs to watch for, the bloodline markers that would herald the birth of the last Thornfield. When those signs appeared 27 years ago, we began our hunt. His massive head turned towards Seraphina, and she could see genuine anguish in his expression. I came here prepared to end a threat to supernatural stability. I never expected to find someone whose very existence might be the key to our evolution. But you still plan to kill me, Seraphina said, her voice deadly quiet as power built around her in patterns that spoke of destruction barely held in check. Every protective gesture, every moment of seeming concern, it was all manipulation designed to make me trust the hand that would eventually strike me down. The betrayal felt like acid in her veins, corroding the brief happiness she'd found in believing she'd finally discovered allies who valued her for more than what she could provide. Before Fenris could respond, Lysander Drakemore's voice echoed through the broken windows once more, but now his words carried new urgency that suggested he'd sensed the shift in dynamics within the castle. The hour grows late, Thornfield Witch. Submit to judgment, or face the combined might of every supernatural faction in existence. Your wards will not hold against coordinated assault, and your protectors. His voice took on a note of dark amusement. Well, perhaps you should ask them about their true intentions before placing your faith so completely in their loyalty. The Vampire Council's enforcer knew. Somehow, Lysander had detected the fractures in her alliances, the betrayals that threatened to destroy her from within even as external enemies gathered for the final strike. Seraphina realized with crystal clarity that she stood alone against forces that viewed her as either a prize to be claimed or a threat to be eliminated, and the one being she'd begun to trust as a protector had been revealed as her most dangerous enemy of all. From her position of terrible isolation, surrounded by enemies wearing the faces of allies, Seraphina smiled for the first time in 20 years. But it wasn't the expression of someone who had found happiness. It was the smile of someone who had finally understood that survival required embracing the very darkness she'd spent her life trying to resist. She'd found her answer to a lifetime of powerlessness, and it tasted like lightning and blood on her tongue. Chapter 5: The Council of Blood and Bone. The great hall of the castle transformed as Seraphina's power awakened every protective ward her ancestors had woven into its very stones. Ancient symbols blazed to life along the walls, creating a sanctuary that even the combined might of supernatural factions couldn't breach by force. But Lysander Drakemore didn't come with force, he came with law, settling into the hall's carved throne with the casual authority of someone who had arbitrated supernatural disputes for over 1,000 years. His pale beauty was perfect and terrible, like marble carved by a master sculptor, and when he spoke, power older than kingdoms rang in his voice. Seraphina Thornfield, you stand accused of awakening territorial magic without proper binding or council oversight. Behind him filed representatives of every major supernatural faction, vampires whose eyes held the hunger of eternity, werewolves whose barely contained wildness made Fenris look civilized by comparison, and fey nobles whose beauty could drive mortals mad with a single glance. But it was the coven of 3 witches that made Seraphina's blood run cold. Their leader, ancient beyond measure, stepped forward with a smile that promised pain. Sister, the crone said, her voice like grinding stone. You have broken laws written in blood before your mother was born. The penalty is binding or death. Around them, the assembled supernatural court murmured agreement, and Seraphina realized this wasn't a trial, it was a sentencing. Kieran moved to stand at her right side, his presence a silent declaration of alliance that made several vampires hiss with displeasure. Fenris took her left, his massive frame radiating protective fury that had the werewolf delegates backing away instinctively. She claims right of self-determination, Kieran announced, his voice carrying across the hall with ancient authority. By her bloodline and by her power, she stands above council law. Lysander's perfect features arranged themselves into an expression of mild amusement. A vampire speaks for pack magic? How unprecedented. His gaze shifted to Fenris, whose golden eyes blazed with challenge. And an alpha defends a bloodline that could command his pack's absolute loyalty? Curious alliances indeed. The witch crone stepped closer, her rheumy eyes fixed on Seraphina with predatory interest. The girl knows nothing of what she is, nothing of the responsibilities her power carries. She cannot be permitted to, but her words cut off as Seraphina's magic flared, sending silver light cascading through the hall like liquid starfire. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every Thornfield who had come before. I know exactly what I am, she said, power making the air itself tremble. I am the last free Thornfield, and I will not be bound by laws written to keep my family in chains. The assembled court fell silent, recognizing the shift in magical currents that spoke of power beyond their comprehension. Then you choose trial by combat, Lysander said, and his smile revealed fangs that had tasted the blood of kings. Ancient law grants you the right to defend your freedom through strength of arms. Choose your champion. But Seraphina's answering smile held no fear, only the terrible confidence of someone who had finally understood her own worth. I choose myself, she declared, and around them the hall erupted in shocked murmurs. No witch had stood trial by combat in over 3 centuries, and none had ever faced the supernatural court's chosen champion alone. As if summoned by her declaration, the hall's great doors burst open to reveal a figure from nightmare, the Vampire Council's executioner, whose very presence made the ancient stones weep blood. The executioner who entered the hall was a creature from the supernatural world's darkest legends, 7 feet of muscle and shadow wrapped in midnight black armor that seemed to absorb light itself. His face was hidden behind a helm forged from the skulls of his victims, and when he moved, the very air grew cold with the promise of death. For 500 years, he had been the Vampire Council's final judgment, the being they sent when mercy was no longer an option. Seraphina Thornfield, his voice echoed from behind the bone helm like wind through graveyards. You will face Malachar the Bloodless, champion of the Eternal Court. Surrender now, or feed the stones with your magic. But as Malachar drew his cursed blade, a weapon that had tasted the blood of gods, Seraphina felt no fear. Instead, power roared through her veins like molten gold, and she understood finally what her mother had died to protect. Not just bloodline magic, but the fundamental force that bound all supernatural territories to the natural world. She was living law, walking balance, the bridge between mortal realm and eternal night. I am Seraphina Thornfield, she declared, silver fire dancing around her fingers, daughter of Eleanor the Wise, inheritor of pacts older than your councils, and I do not yield to dead things that have forgotten what it means to be alive. The battle that followed shook the castle to its foundations as ancient magic clashed with supernatural fury. Malachar moved with the speed of 5 centuries of violence, his cursed blade leaving trails of darkness in the air, but Seraphina's power flowed like living water around his attacks. Where he brought death, she brought renewal. Where he wielded shadow, she commanded starlight. Kieran and Fenris stood ready to intervene, but both realized this was beyond their ability to influence. This was primal magic asserting its dominion over creatures that had grown too comfortable with power. When Malachar's blade finally struck her, it shattered against skin that had become living moonlight. Impossible, Lysander breathed, his perfect composure cracking as his champion fell to his knees before a castle slave who had become something beyond supernatural politics. Around the hall, faction representatives backed away as Seraphina's power reached its crescendo, reminding them all why the Thornfield bloodline had once been courted rather than commanded. But as the magic settled and Malachar dissolved into shadow and memory, Seraphina turned to address the assembled court with regal authority that brooked no argument. I claim sanctuary right for this territory and all who shelter under my protection. Your councils have no power here, and any who challenge that truth will face the same judgment as your champion. One by one, the supernatural factions bowed their heads in acknowledgement before filing out into the storm-lashed night, leaving Seraphina alone with her chosen allies. Kieran stepped closer, his silver eyes bright with something that might have been love, while Fenris's massive head lowered in a gesture of profound respect. What happens now? The vampire asked, and for the first time since her awakening, Seraphina allowed herself to truly smile. Now we rebuild, she said, power still humming through the ancient stones around them. This castle becomes what it was always meant to be, a sanctuary for those who don't fit anywhere else. But as dawn approached and her newfound family settled into planning their future, neither vampire nor werewolf noticed the figure watching from the shadows beyond the broken windows. Someone else had survived the supernatural purges, someone with their own claim to Thornfield power, and their eyes